wrong. And I've been speaking kind of obliquely about the choices that Harper Lee and her editor made together. The very straightforward thing to say is Harper Lee arrived to a basically integrated New York City from an incredibly segregated small town in Alabama. You could call it a road to Damascus moment. Life looked very different in New York. Civilization hadn't ended. In fact, it was flourishing. And so understandably, this small town girl, some of the experience she has is questioning the society she grew up in and interrogating the beliefs of people she admired, including her own father. Neither Go Set a Watchman nor To Kill a Mockingbird are autobiographies or memoirs. They're fiction, and there are really deliberately fictional elements. But I think it's important to realize it is in some ways a very straightforward drama of a daughter making sense of her parents. And in that sense, your son's teacher is absolutely right. Go Set a Watchman in some ways is just an angrier, more judgmental, more perceptive look at a parent. And the choice to take that story and restrict the point of view in To Kill a Mockingbird means we never confront the adult narrator's assessment of her father, which is what's happening in Go Set a Watchman. It's completely autobiographical. A 20-something Alabamian who's been living in New York City comes home to take care of her alien father, and judgment ensues. Arguments about integration ensue. But with To Kill a Mockingbird, the timeline and the point of view are really compressed. So what we get instead is the idolized vision of a father by a daughter who's 9 years old, who's 7 years old. This tiny, compact period of time where he can do no wrong and he is all hero. So I think that assessment is pretty astute. Probably, too, what your son's teacher is invoking is there's a very complicated kind of middle-class genteel racism that Harper Lee confronts in Go Set a Watchman that was stripped out of To Kill a Mockingbird. In particular, she talks about the White Citizens Council and some of these institutions that weren't the Klan. They were more respectable. They were more involved in civic life. And men like her father, in fact, were members of and participated in. When I said it's a more complicated political story, it is much more realistic. But I think that a lot of literary critics would say the novel therefore suffers, and that part of the genius of what the editor did with Harper Lee is say, this might be more realistic and you might feel it better represents the South. But we can tell a better story, and if we make these other decisions, it will be a better aesthetic object. And I think the truth is that editor wasn't wrong. To Kill a Mockingbird was a bestseller. It won a Pulitzer. It was both critically and commercially successful in a way that I think if Harper Lee had published Go Set a Watchman in 1960, it would have sold a couple hundred copies and we would never have heard about it. So the choices they made were really deliberate. And so Furious Hours is structured in this way that's partly about the true crime story that Harper Lee wanted to write in the 70s and 80s. But the last third is about her life as a writer and what brought her to the place of collaborating with Capote on In Cold Blood and undertaking her own true crime project. In that story, I just talk a lot about, it's a publishing story. It's a story about what the publishing world wants and the expectations for Southern stories, the ability to confront complicated political narratives. And the truth is, in the late 50s, New York City publishing was not so much interested in a book about a bad Southerner who participates in a bad, systemically racist society. They were much more interested in a book which said, look, there are some good men in the South right now who are right on the race question, who are fighting to change it. It was a hero they wanted, and they were right. And I think that's part of the book's enduring appeal. I'm glad your son's teacher was kind of pointing them in both directions and talking about what they might find there. And again, that's the sort of stuff, frankly, I wish your son's teacher had annotated Go Set a Watchman when it was published. Giving context for the character, it's not boring, it's even more interesting. So I think that's the kind of stuff that was lost. When I do events for Furious Hours, I often do a show of hands of how many of you have read To Kill a Mockingbird. Every hand in the room goes up, and then I say, how many of you read Go Set a Watchman? It's almost always 50-50. And then when I ask a couple people, why didn't you read it? There are people who just say, well, I didn't think she wanted it published, or I didn't want to change my vision of Atticus. And people have these very principled stances. It's not like they didn't get around to it. It's still a very divisive question of what she wanted and what we're ready for.
You mentioned her friendship with Truman Capote. I read in an interview where she had some objections to In Cold Blood. Can you tell us what those were?
Absolutely. When you write a book, the characters have so many different relationships to each other. And for a lot of people, the most interesting relationship in their life is their relationship to their parents or their spouses. Harper Lee never married. A lot of people already know about her relationship to her father because he was the model for Atticus, but not as many people know about this tremendously interesting friendship she had. It didn't start with In Cold Blood. It actually goes back to the small town in Alabama. Improbably, Capote, who was actually born in New Orleans, had some family who lived in Monroeville. And they not only lived in the same town, they literally lived right next door to the Lee family. And so for many years of their childhood, he had a complicated home life. He and his mother lived with those cousins, and there he was next door to Harper Lee. And they wrote stories together, and they palled around town together. Even when his mother moved away, they stayed in touch. In fact, he was one of the few people she knew in New York. When she moved there, he helped get her set up and make introductions. And for a little while, they had the same literary representation. But at a certain point, right around the time To Kill a Mockingbird was finally finished and the proofs were in, Harper Lee, who had basically run out of money and had no job, needed a way to get by. And Capote had just taken this assignment for the New Yorker. He wanted someone else to go, and that friend wasn't available. So he said to Harper Lee, do you want to go out to Kansas with me to help report this murder story? And so that's how she got involved in Cold Blood. And she was there for almost all of his reporting over the next 3 years. In that initial reporting visit, she was basically in for every interview and conducted her own research. Together, they gathered the documents and the transcripts and the autopsy reports that became the kind of bedrock of In Cold Blood. I'm giving you this background because I think it's important to realize just how saturated she was in the story. She had really participated in all of the work. And that's why when the book finally came out 5 years later, when Hickok and Smith had exhausted all their appeals, when they were finally executed, that's when Capote chose to publish the book. There was Harper Lee to look at it and compare it to everything she'd heard and everything she'd learned, and to think about the decisions Capote was making. And so I talked about how Harper Lee's life was really a publishing story. Part of it is just a story about ethics in journalism and ethics in true crime. And the objections that she had to In Cold Blood, some of them were picayune. They were small things that had been changed or glossed over. But some of them were larger and more structural. And I think in that sense, when the two of them went to Kansas, the idea was to write about how a murder affects a small town. And if you've read In Cold Blood, you know that positionally that book is actually about the experience of the accused and the convicted and the guilty. And ultimately, the kind of sympathy and the narrative perspective of the book shifts. And I think that's one of the deep objections or curiosities Harper Lee had. It was supposed to be about the victims, and it ended up being about the perpetrators. I quote a lot of letters in Furious Hours where Harper Lee is talking to people about In Cold Blood and expressing her frustration. She never spoke publicly about it. She never denounced the book. She never did anything as wildly public as that. But she stayed in touch with Capote's fact checker at the New Yorker, and the two of them talked a lot about the decisions Capote had made. And in fact, Harper Lee actually stayed in touch with some of the people in Kansas who had been in the book. I wish that she had written even more about it, but the letters are quite illuminating, and I think pose real challenges for the way that we tell these stories and think about them. In her case, very straightforwardly, I think she was aware of the fact that as a writer, you make decisions all the time about who is a hero and who is a villain and who's going to get a sympathetic portrayal or not. And when she settled down in the small town in Alabama to write the story that my book is about, which is truly a crazy story of a reverend accused of killing 5 family members, and he was shot at the funeral of his last victim, and his lawyer then went on to defend the vigilante. It's a messy story. I think Harper Lee was taking some of her objections to In Cold Blood and trying to work them out in this other project. She was also trying to work out the problems of Go Set a Watchman and To Kill a Mockingbird. She wondered if there were real heroes or if there could ever be simple stories. And that's a lot of what's going on, and I talk about it some in the book. I think it's really fruitful. Even if you don't like Harper Lee, if you're a big Capote fan, I think Furious Hours would be interesting for that reason, because it's kind of looking under the hood of In Cold Blood and how it was written and what she thought of it, and frankly, what some of the characters in the book thought of it too.
I have a very good friend. She's since now passed on. She sat next to Dick Hickok all through high school.
Oh my God.
She just could not believe that he would get involved with this. She said he was so quiet and so polite. She had a crush on him for a couple years.
Again, I told you the story that Capote and Lee went out there to work on. Some of what happened was really just the charisma of Hickok and Smith both. It's so interesting you asked me earlier about how I did or didn't identify with Harper Lee. I think that Capote, in a really straightforward psychological way, got to a town where the victims had less in common with his experience than the perpetrators. He had been an outsider. He had been mocked. He had been out of sorts with his own milieu and had to go and make his way in the world. It was a kind of, not a criminal, but an outsider. And so when he met these two men and he heard about their experience and he learned about their complicated home lives, I think very quickly, just in a very human way, he thought, these people deserve sympathy too. And of course, he went on to become a real advocate for the abolish capital punishment movement. I think a lot of that came from his experience with Hickok and Smith, of feeling like he did not write an exonerative book. It wasn't like he said they didn't commit these murders. What he said was, here's why they did, and here's maybe why they didn't deserve to die for it. And that became an ethic of his. He's just as complicated as Harper Lee is, and I don't mean to make it seem like he cut corners with the book. Again, when you say what were her objections, there's fabricated scenes, kind of invented dialogue, and these tools of fiction that got smuggled into a nonfiction project. You could say, well, was anyone hurt? It made the story better. Or you could say, is there such a thing as nonfiction, and should we strive for it, or should we be forthright with our readers about the choices we're making? And I think it's all very tricky, and I raise a lot of questions in the book, and Harper Lee did too. And I think it's for readers to decide. Some people don't need it to be all nonfiction. They just want a gripping story. Some people would rather it be a kind of boring book with a lot of unanswered questions because they want only the facts. That's its own kind of drama around mystery and true crime.
I've read that Capote was in love with Perry Smith.
Definitely a kind of over-identification. And then, right, some people think that they were romantically involved, which, as best I can tell from the actual kind of testimony of the court and prison officials, there have been these two biopics, one of which insinuated they actually had a relationship. The testimony of the authorities from the time makes that seem impossible. They did exchange letters, they did talk on the phone, and I think there was a very deep bond, one so deep that it did change the tone of the book.
Were Harper Lee's objections enough to affect the relationship between she and Truman Capote?
Great question. So the thing to know, right, the two of them, having been so close as children and having stayed in touch as adults, really had a falling out after In Cold Blood. I think a lot of people, including Harper Lee's sister, used to joke that that was because he didn't win a Pulitzer and she had. But it actually seems like the two of them parted ways over this other kind of deeper question about the truth. And there's a really heartbreaking letter I quote in Furious Hours that Harper Lee wrote to that fact checker who had worked on In Cold Blood. She basically says that Capote was really cruel and difficult to people who loved him, and that included her, but that also he had long obliterated the possibility of a true account or a fact. That's a very deep wound for someone. I think meant that when she saw his willingness to change the story of what happened in Kansas, she realized that meant he was willing to change the truth in his everyday life. And things that had seemed like harmless gossip before were the same kind of manipulation and distortion, and that he was a very difficult person. I think in ways that are meaningful too, Capote had very serious substance abuse problems, and they worsened throughout his later life. He actually died of an overdose. For Lee, who was struggling with her own drinking problem, I think in some ways, just very straightforwardly, some of what happened is the two of them were struggling with the same kind of success, but with very different coping mechanisms. Again, another way that she was very judgmental is later in life, she was very angry at the effort to kind of rehabilitate Capote's reputation and to smooth over the fraught personality and the manipulation and the drug abuse. This kind of comic letter about how the University of Alabama has endowed a scholarship for him, which they would never have done in his own lifetime. He would show up at these awards things and lectures and just be publicly drunk and disorderly. And so she says, of course, they wouldn't have done it even as homosexuality was offensive at the time. And so she's upset that the University of Alabama, that would have nothing to do with him in his lifetime, is now like endowed this award. I think it was a very complicated friendship. It was fraught in personal and professional ways, and there was jealousy and there was collaboration. I just want to lift up one thing, and it's actually my favorite photograph in the book. I include this photograph of the two of them together in 1976. So for all of this talk that they had a falling out, they did, but they did stay in touch. I interviewed the photographer who took that picture in 1976. He said it was like watching a brother and sister reunite, and that they instantly seemed like children. And even though they were on 2nd Avenue in New York City, the photographer said it was like watching them walk around the courthouse square in Macomb. That instantly all of the difficulty and disagreement and vitriol just evaporated. And there they were, two lifelong friends who had weathered all sorts of difficulties and all kinds of fame and acclaim. And there they were, just the same as they had been as children. So it's its own complicated relationship. And I don't want to oversimplify it. They did have a falling out, but it's not as if they never spoke again.
On to another one of Harper Lee's works, the one that the book is mostly about, and that is of the Reverend Willie Maxwell. You spent time in Alabama for your research. Does his story live on down there?
Oh my gosh, does it ever? So this takes place in Alexander City, which is not far from the Georgia line.